Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan. Once again, this is We the Governed. I've actually got 3 different topics I'm going to kind of rapid fire try to go through today in this video just to give you an update on a number of things that are happening throughout the state. First, I want to mention to you in this video, I will be addressing it from my perspective anyway, just an update on this story about the Department of Licensing and the executive order in relation to our voter rolls and where I think we're at on this and what I think you can do about it. Secondly, I'm going to go into a little story out of Sedro Woolley and surprisingly a Cascadia News article that came out about it, and I'll be discussing that whole issue on a mayor that's in a little bit more trouble than she probably wants to be right now. And also just a quick update on what some of the results are, I think, that we're seeing of as many people are getting out there and starting to look into local government, and in particular with the little town clerk here who just was placed on leave pending a fraud investigation. So lots of stuff to get to, but before we do, if I could encourage you, if you haven't done so already, hit the subscribe and like button down below. It really does help us if more people are sharing these videos out with their neighbors and friends and even some of their political enemies, because you never know when sharing a little bit of truth and exposing the truth about what's actually going on in Washington State will make a difference where you and I live, in the state that we all love. So let's get into this little story here about a town clerk who was just placed on leave a couple weeks ago pending a fraud investigation. And this is in the big and booming town of Metaline. And I'm going to point out to you, this is just from an article that was forwarded to me by one of the attendees of some of our DOGE classes out in Pend Oreille County. If you don't know where the town of Metaline is, I don't blame you, because even people who have a high degree of geographic education about Washington State probably don't know. But this is a chance to give you a little bit more of an update on Washington State geography. In the far northeast corner of Washington is the beautiful county of Pend Oreille, and there is a town of Metaline up in that county, and that is the town in which the town clerk was just put on leave pending this current fraud investigation. Now, I'm not sure that we really know how much money has gone missing. It's at least somewhere around $35,000. But of course, as the fraud investigation progresses, we'll get to find out exactly how much money went missing, even in that little town of Metaline. And trust me, if it can happen in the town of Metaline, small little place in the corner of Washington, it's probably going on in a city or a county or another jurisdiction where you live as well. All it takes is people like you and I and others who are willing to actually go in there and follow the money and look at what's happening. And lots of things like this, unfortunately, will be exposed, but it's way better to expose them than to let them go unchecked and with nobody paying attention. Speaking of the DOGE training, this is actually a picture of the Enumclaw event from just a few days ago. It was in a brewery there. Actually got a free shirt here from them. Thank you for the swag. It's the Griffin Brewery. They hosted it. Here, I'll show it here a little bit more obvious here. I always enjoy the swag from the event. This was hosted at a brewery. We did this training session there. So from churches to bars and everywhere in between throughout Washington State, we are training hundreds of people to become more familiar with how to use a Public Records Act, how to follow the money, and how to be a DOGE Washington trained citizen who is actually going to start holding government accountable and not just letting them continue to do things in darkness and without the attention that I think the publicity that they need and attention that we need to bring on them and find out what's actually going on. Which brings me to the next part of this story, which was actually a Cascadia Daily news story of all places. Now, these guys usually here wouldn't be exactly the media that I would expect to report on anything I do, at least without calling me lots of names. But in this case, they actually referred to me as the anti-corruption activist, a title that I wear proudly. And it's about a complaint that I filed here against the Sedro Woolley Mayor. And it was in regards to basically concealing from her financial affairs documents a grant that was approved by the Sedro Woolley City Council. It was actually a grant that was given to her husband's business. Now, I want to point out this a little bit because this is, you can find my complaint. It's a public document, pdc.wa.gov. By the way, it's kudos to you if you will spot the stupid typo that I allowed to still sit on that complaint, which is what happens when you file hundreds of these and sometimes use a template for them. But if you go there and you actually look at the complaint, I want to point out a couple basic documents that were relatively easy to prove that this is what's going on. I find this to be, unfortunately, a common violation. Now, the mayor of Sedro Woolley there, Julia Johnson, she basically had this company called Tight Lies LLC. I'm not sure why you would call your company Tight Lies, but I'm not here to judge. That was identified as one of the businesses owned by her spouse, and it was clearly identified on the financial disclosure document. However, it also requires them to identify when you're receiving money from the government when you sit on the board of that government, and you're actually in charge of the money in the first place. And you can see here, and I've attached this, you can see it in the complaint itself, but the check registry where it shows the check that actually went out to this entity, as well as the grant application, and she voted on that and approved it. She says she didn't vote on it, but it basically happened while she's on the city council, and the financial disclosure document doesn't require you to actually vote on it. It just says that if you actually serve in that council, you need to disclose this. It doesn't make it illegal to send money to your friends and family and spouses, but you have to disclose it so that people are aware of where that money's going, and she failed to do so. Honestly, this is the kind of thing I find very common in local government. It just, nobody's looking. But if you look at some of those more shady actors in local government who have been elected to office, you're going to find lots of problems like this, and you too can file complaints just like this, or you can send it to me and I'll file it for you because I just do this stuff for fun. Now let's jump into the story that probably many of you are interested in, and one I am following as closely as I can as well, because I think this is actually quite significant and important for Washington State. And it had to do with a series of videos and stories that I've done about this, and actually it goes back many years now in regards to election integrity, and specifically the Department of Licensing and their history, endless history, of registering non-U.S. citizens to not just get a driver's license, but registering them to vote in the state of Washington. And inevitably, this sequence of stories is leading to probably a couple of events coming up, I believe late June, and it's partially based on this executive order that President Trump signed back in March, and it had to do with preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections. Now, if you go into that in Section 2, there's a clause right here that says that within 90 days, and that 90-day window is coming due this week, so presuming the Department of Homeland Security is actually going to follow that executive order and provide the information to the Secretary of State and to auditors in Washington State of all the non-U.S. citizens that have been registered to vote, and perhaps who have also voted, and whether they're here legally or illegally. And this is supposed to start the process of cleaning up election rolls, not just in Washington, but throughout the nation. Now, if you happen to live in a state which is not Washington, and you actually are trying to cooperate with cleaning up the voter rolls, and that's actually something you aspire to do, then this information will be helpful, and perhaps it's a good check. I noticed that the state of Texas was discovering lots of non-U.S. citizens who are registered to vote there, and I'm seeing this happen now in more and more states as they start to realize just how screwed up their election system has been, especially going back to the Motor Voter Act. Now, I've done some other videos on this topic before, so I'm not trying to repeat everything, but this executive order and the deadline that's rapidly approaching here raises some questions. And what some of the questions are exactly what will Homeland Security do with this list? Are they going to keep it kind of secret and then provide it to the Secretary of State? And if so, I don't think that's going to necessarily produce the results that we're hoping to see in Washington State to clean up the voter rolls. So there's going to be some things I'm going to be asking you to do here as we dig into this, because believe me, I think the Attorney General, federal Attorney General here, the Department of Justice here, has actually got their hands full with a number of other issues, including their litigation in New York, which could happen identically in Washington over the tendency of that state to hand out driver's licenses and to illegals and register them to vote just willy-nilly like confetti machines. And that's how Washington State operates as well. So what that means as we look through it, of course, is that the automatic response in Washington State was within a few days of that executive order. You saw here that both Washington and the Oregon Attorney General, along with a few other Democrat Attorney Generals, they immediately sued the Trump administration, of course, to conceal any and stop any efforts to restore any kind of election integrity to the voting process, and in particular the voting rolls. And this is not unique, but it's important to understand that our Attorney General, Nick Brown, supported strongly by his former boss and Bob Ferguson, the Attorney General himself as well, or now he's the governor, acting governor here. And they are basically suing to conceal any effort to clean up the corrupt election rolls in Washington State. So the suing for secrecy effort that they're involved in right now, they aren't alone, but they're certainly unfortunately on that bandwagon with some of these other Democrat AGs from around the state. So this is all going on, but of course the Department of Homeland Security doesn't prevent them from making some policy changes that I think are fairly significant. And I do believe that all we're really starting with on this executive order and revealing the non-U.S. citizens registered to vote is just revealing that tip of the iceberg of the problems that we unfortunately do have in the election process, not just in Washington State, Oregon, California, Colorado, Arizona, the number of other states around the country, but we care about Washington State. And so one of the things that I believe we're going to just have to have exposed in this process here is obviously, first of all, identifying the registered illegals who have been registered to vote plus given driver's licenses, and then the legal foreigners, the people here who legitimately could get a driver's license but have also been registered to vote, frequently against their will, by the way. And then, of course, identifying how many of these actually did vote over the past several election cycles, and then how screwed up is everything else in our election system. This is fairly significant, and this is exactly the kind of information that neither Bob Ferguson, Nick Brown, nor any Democrat that exists in Washington State appears that they want to have any of this information out there in public, which is why you saw Secretary of State Hobbs, right after that executive order, come out and say, I see nothing, there's nothing to see here, everything's perfect, our rules are perfect, and we don't want your help in cleaning them up. And our Secretary of State Hobbs is doing his best Sergeant Schultz here, claiming that he sees nothing, he hears nothing, and he knows nothing. The reality is starting to expose the truth with these lists that Homeland Security completely controls is going to be a first step, in my opinion at least, towards making some improvements. But meanwhile, we're going to see a lot of the political insiders telling us there's nothing to see here, move along. You're going to see their controlled state media like the Seattle Times and King 5 News and other places that used to be journalists and used to have journalists working for them, they're going to continue to parrot the narrative that they're being told to promote and pretend that there's nothing to see here as we try to do our best to clean up the voter rolls in Washington State and elsewhere. And of course, as the House of Cards collapses on the foolish narrative that they have that there's nothing to see or nothing to fix, there are some things I think we can do to try to make a difference. And number one, any way that you have to get the word out here, I'll do my best, but I'm asking you to do it as well in contacting your elected officials, contacting the Trump administration, send information to their hotline. Having the Department of Homeland Security just go public with those lists of all the non-U.S. citizens that are registered to vote in Washington State. There's no reason not to. If they're breaking the law, it should be a public record, and we should know. It'll also give us a better sense of exactly how screwed up the election system is here, and it allows us to kind of crowdsource the effort of putting pressure on our local auditors and the Secretary of State to actually go do the job that the Secretary of State clearly doesn't want to do, and that the Democrat Party is basically telling them not to do. Secondly, of course, part of the reason why we want to do that is we want to put this pressure on them to actually remove the non-U.S. citizens who are registered to vote in Washington State. Whether they voted or not, they should not be registered to vote because that artificially inflates the voter rolls in a way that's dishonest and corrupt. And although I'm sure they don't prefer to fix the corruption, for the rest of us who actually want accurate and honest elections, we need to demand that they do that and they start to fix it. And of course, the inevitable domino effect and why this becomes a house of cards, why nobody in the administration wants to look at this in our state administration, is because it begins to expose the other problems with the voter rolls that we all know exist if we bothered to spend any amount of time actually going in and digging into them. It doesn't mean that every single theory out there is accurate as to what the problems are, but we've got plenty of problems that we can work on to clean up, and it starts with something like that. Or, of course, you can also decide that because everything's not perfect and because it's not utopia, you can pre-surrender and you can run away, because that certainly will show those bureaucrats that they won't get away with their corrupt and dishonest and bad behavior, because I'm positive that you can find utopia to run to where there's absolutely not a single corrupt politician of any political party and the bureaucrats all do the right thing. But of course, that utopia doesn't exist, and you will discover that when you flee and you run there. We have to be involved and we have to engage, and this is what I oftentimes say, and I'm always going to continue to repeat it. You have to be part of the change that you want to see happen. You have to be engaged, you have to show up, you have to make a difference, because that's the only way to make a change. It starts with you and I, it starts with showing up, because the future belongs to those who show up.